In this video, we'll be looking at one of the most unfairly maligned woodwind instruments, the alto clarinet. The alto clarinet is pitched in the key of E flat, so it transposes in the same way as an alto sax. The lowest note on the instrument is written low E flat, sounding concert G flat 2. A relative of the alto clarinet is the basset horn. It has a similar shape, but is pitched in F instead of E flat. The basset horn was a favourite instrument of Mozart's. He used 2 basset horns in his Requiem alongside 2 bassoons, which are the only woodwind instruments in the piece, and he also employed it in some of his operas and other important works. Richard Strauss is sometimes credited with resurrecting the basset horn in orchestral music, and wrote for it in his operas Elektra, Der Rosenkavalier, and others. Strauss was quite fond of the instrument. Additionally, it appears in the enormous orchestra of Havergal Brian's famous Gothic Symphony, where it has a few important solos. Whilst it is acknowledged that the alto clarinet is usually pitched in E flat and the basset horn in F, alto clarinets in F have been produced in the past. The alto clarinet usually has a wider bore than the basset horn, although nowadays this is not always so clear-cut, since both wide and narrow bore versions of each instrument are available. The general consensus is that the alto clarinet has a bigger, warmer sound and projects more easily in larger ensembles, whereas the basset horn is said to be a little lighter and more focused in tone, and its highest notes are more usable. As a result, the alto clarinet often appears in bands, wind ensembles and clarinet choirs, whilst the basset horn features in orchestral and chamber music. Here is an excerpt of a performance of chamber music featuring both instruments. It is clear that they do blend very well together, so any major differences in tone are not immediately obvious. There can sometimes be confusion with the alto clarinet's function in relation to other members of the clarinet family. Let's analyse why. The standard B-flat and A clarinets, whilst technically soprano clarinets, are not usually called as such by all clarinetists, and very rarely so by composers. Some believe that another distant relative, the basset clarinet, should be renamed the true alto clarinet, since it falls between the B-flat and E-flat alto in range. The E-flat alto would then have to be called a tenor clarinet, whilst the basset horn keeps its current name. The alto clarinet descends quite low for an alto instrument. In fact, its lowest note is 1 semitone below the G string on a cello or double bass. It is interesting to note that there was a period where the instrument was indeed called a tenor clarinet, in England particularly, though I'm yet to find an early score that calls for a tenor clarinet. This stems from the strange way the nomenclature of the clarinet family jumps from alto to bass and omits the description tenor completely, unlike the saxophone family, for example, which has every type of voice covered in some way. Others say we should reclassify the basset horn as an alto clarinet in F, whilst the E-flat alto be renamed tenor clarinet as previously mentioned, but this ignores the fact that the basset horn's lowest note is 1 semitone below the alto clarinet's lowest note.
Warte, 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 warte.
Whilst I can see the argument that the name tenor more accurately describes the register of the alto clarinet, the basset clarinet is far too rare a visitor in orchestral music generally to be given such a standard term as alto clarinet, since it is even more specialised than the basset horn. Also, the use of the term alto is relative to the term soprano in the context of instrumental families. The lowest note of the standard B-flat clarinet, deemed a soprano instrument, is D3, a note certainly not in the range of a normal soprano voice. So it follows that if the E-flat alto clarinet is the next lowest clarinet, which is fairly commonplace, and plays notes lower than concert D3, it seems logical to call it an alto clarinet. That said, I see no major issue in calling an alto clarinet a tenor clarinet, or a basset horn an alto clarinet in F in a score, as long as the composer is clear about what instrument they're writing for. The French composer Berlioz said that the alto clarinet is a beautiful instrument which ought to take its place in all well-established orchestras. But despite this glowing review, Berlioz never wrote for the instrument. The alto clarinet wasn't accepted into the orchestra as Berlioz suggested it would be. The famous instrument maker Adolphe Sax had improved the bass clarinet's design, and so this was welcomed into the symphony orchestra and is now a standard member of the woodwind section, which initially began with 19th century composers such as Berlioz, Wagner and Liszt, creating important parts for the bass clarinet in their works when it began to be used seriously in the orchestra. This is possibly why the alto clarinet did not establish itself in the orchestra. The bass clarinet got there first. Instead, the alto clarinet became a regular in bands, whilst the basset horn has always remained an occasional visitor to the symphony orchestra since the 18th century. From around the 1950s, there was a growing movement to expel the alto clarinet from the standard wind band. The argument was that the part always doubles another instrument completely, usually the third clarinet or alto sax, it doesn't play in tune, and is generally superfluous to the modern wind band. There are several reasons for this train of thought catching on. In an educational setting, a band director might not always know at the start of a particular year the exact makeup of his band. Will he have 4 clarinets or 14? So to create a balanced sound, players often get reassigned to unfamiliar instruments at the last minute. So in this case, a third clarinet player might find themselves on alto clarinet unexpectedly. They might resent this, and as such won't fully enjoy playing the instrument. We have a less skilled, reluctant player on an instrument that really demands a bit more specialisation. Ideally, a band should have a strong second or first player on alto clarinet. A band's bass clarinet or E-flat clarinet player, by contrast, would normally have use of that instrument for a long time to get familiar with it. They will practice on it regularly to produce and maintain a professional quality tone. Sadly, the alto clarinet doesn't always receive the same treatment. Secondly, a lot of alto clarinets owned by bands in educational or amateur sectors might not be serviced as regularly as they should be. The pads on the keys may not be in good condition, or maybe they have bent keywork. Some band directors might not appreciate the full potential of the instrument. If they've been told repeatedly by colleagues that the alto clarinet is worthless, they will decide not to bother to invest in maintaining one so as to keep it in a playable condition. As a consequence, the instrument would not sound at its best, and composers were put off and discouraged from writing interesting parts for the alto clarinet. Or, if they did use it, they simply copied another part to deliberately hide it within the texture, which enhances the notion that the part is irrelevant and does not make a worthwhile contribution to a piece. Perhaps instrument manufacturers should also take part of the blame. The basset horn is mainly thought of as an orchestral instrument. So, to ensure future professional performances of the aforementioned works of high stature by Richard Strauss or Mozart, which feature the basset horn, clarinet makers produced high-quality basset horns, but perhaps did not pay the same amount of attention to their alto clarinets. Some instruments went unchanged for years. The basset horn always seems to be the more respected of the two instruments, and is certainly not derided as much as the alto clarinet. The problem, therefore, is a combination of factors, which all led to composers being discouraged from including alto clarinet parts in their works, to the point where it became a habit to omit the alto clarinet altogether. This blanket writing off of the alto clarinet stuck around the wind band community for a large part of the latter half of the 20th century. Composers ignored it, or adopted a rather indifferent attitude towards it, so bands used that as a justification to disparage it. Let's look at how to write for the alto clarinet. We need to begin with the notion that the alto clarinet does have an individual voice. The low register is robust and a little more reedy to my ears than the corresponding notes on the bass clarinet. An oft-quoted example of this is version B of Percy Grainger's Rufford Park Poachers from Lincolnshire Posy. The alto clarinet plays the melody in octaves with the piccolo. An eerie sound is created, almost like a weird organ stop. The middle register is versatile, yet also quite gentle, and notes from within the stave upwards for about an octave and a half can be particularly expressive in tone. This would be the best register for solo lines. In my orchestration of Bach's Passacaglia and Fugue in C minor for band, at the start of the fugue, the first subject is heard on the alto clarinet, with the E-flat clarinet playing the second fugal subject. I chose this scoring because of the register the notes fall in. If I put this passage on a solo B-flat clarinet, it falls in the middle register, which has a thinner quality to the sound. Now, whilst that certainly has its uses, it didn't feel right for this moment. On the alto clarinet, the same passage is written further up the stave, a very comfortable part of the instrument. It projects well and can be played with more expression. The upper register is certainly useful, and a composer need not feel that they should avoid high notes on the alto clarinet. They will no doubt have an intensity similar to higher members of the clarinet family playing in the upper part of their range, although its main purpose is certainly the thick and warm timbre found in its low and middle register. Anything written for the B-flat or bass clarinets, the alto can do. Trills, florid lines, arpeggiated figures, runs, and leaps should all be fine with a good player on a good instrument. As well as blending seamlessly with other clarinets, the alto clarinet blends successfully with the bassoon and also French horn. If we refer back to Mozart's Requiem, the woodwind section consists solely of 2 basset horns and 2 bassoons, which produces a small yet effective section of 4 players. In a wind ensemble, the alto clarinet could function as a 3rd bassoon, reinforcing harmonies in mid-register chords. Copeland does this in his band piece Emblems from 1964. The alto clarinet also combines very favourably with English horn in its middle and upper register. A melodic line in unison or octaves would have quite a unique timbre. Here are some other instruments that composers can consider pairing with the alto clarinet. The alto clarinet's use in orchestral music is sporadic at best and scant at worst. Stravinsky wrote a part for it in Threnny, but it is written in F, and therefore some argue it should be played on the basset horn and not on a true E-flat alto. The English composer Josef Holbrooke calls for the alto clarinet in many of his works. In the 4th movement of his First Symphony, Holbrooke writes a part marked basset horn or alto clarinet in F. This suggests that as long as he had a clarinet in his woodwind section that fell between the B-flat and the bass, Holbrooke would have been happy with either instrument being used in performance. A few years later he wrote specifically for the alto clarinet in F in his 2nd Symphony, Apollo and the Seamen, and the tone poem Dylan, Son of the Wave. Following this, Holbrooke called for the basset horn in the overture Bronwyn and the tone poem The Children of Don. It's possible that Holbrooke changed his approach at some point after 1900 with regard to the name of this member of his clarinet section, and in doing so demonstrate his appreciation of the subtle differences between the alto clarinet and the basset horn. But this is pure conjecture. It could well be that he simply chose whatever name felt right to him at the time, and the use of either instrument in his pieces would produce the desired effect he was looking for. In these works, Holbrooke scores for the alto clarinet in various ways. Firstly, it functions like a 3rd clarinet with an extended low range, as in this passage in the 3rd movement of the 2nd Symphony. Secondly, it is combined with the oboes and bassoons as an additional colour, like in this passage from the 4th movement, where a little motif passes from oboe to English horn to alto clarinet, the tone quality becoming mellower as it descends in pitch. A similar treatment can be seen in this short passage from Dylan, Son of the Wave, where the alto clarinet plays with the bassoons, violas and cellos. Next, Holbrooke also employs the alto clarinet as a substitute for the bass clarinet, such as this passage from the 1st movement of the 2nd Symphony. And finally, to demonstrate how the alto clarinet easily blends with the strings, this passage from the 1st movement sees the alto clarinet initially combined with the cellos, before joining the 2nd violin's melody an octave lower a few bars later. Holbrooke's orchestral works are worthy of further study in their use of woodwind instruments in general. Let's look at the alto clarinet's place in the modern wind band. An issue frequently brought up with regard to the modern wind band is lack of balance, in particular the clarinet section, which is often cited as being too top-heavy, with 1 E-flat clarinet, lots of B-flat players, then below that we often find 1 alto, 1 bass, and ideally 1 contra-alto or contrabass clarinet. There is an argument that in larger professional bands, 2 altos, 2 basses and 2 contras would produce better balance and increase the richness of the band as a whole, and I'm inclined to agree with that. There is a counter-argument of potential intonation issues, but with regularly maintained instruments and competent players, this should not be a problem. One thing I find very useful about the alto clarinet is that it gives the bass clarinet player a chance to rest. I often feel the bass clarinet player is one of the busiest players in a wind band. Sometimes it is the lowest clarinet available, so if there isn't a more solid low end to the woodwind section containing extra instruments such as a contra-alto or contrabass clarinet, contrabassoon or even a bass sax, which will all provide extra weight in the lowest octave, the bass clarinet spends a lot of its time playing in unison with the bassoons and baritone sax. But it also has to play in softer passages with the other woodwind, since it can play much quieter than those other instruments in that register. The alto clarinet's presence in a band allows the composer to utilise its lowest notes instead, and let the bass clarinet player rest for a brief period. Having looked at the different ways the alto clarinet can be used, let's look at this in practice. For the purpose of these examples, we're thinking purely in terms of a woodwind tutti, so much as we love them, we'll ignore the brass and percussion sections of a concert band for this demonstration. Let's say we have a short phrase with a homophonic texture. In the first instance, we see the scoring is for E-flat clarinet, 3 B-flat clarinets, and a bass, so a standard band grouping of clarinets. There is quite a big gap between the notes of the third clarinet and the bass clarinet, as often happens with this type of writing. Whilst this is sometimes a useful sound in its own right, that gap is noticeable in lightly scored passages if it persists for long periods and isn't always intentional. Adding an alto clarinet, together with a small revision of the chord voicing, fills that gap and adds more depth to the sound. Now in a subsequent passage, perhaps we want a lighter quality to the music. This time, we give the bass clarinet a rest and put the alto at the bottom of the chords. This employs the alto clarinet in its lowest register, which provides an interesting colour change. Later on, we might want a variant of the melody to be played lower down in the band's overall tessitura. If we want the clarinet timbre to feature in this texture, the melody line will sound fine if we put it on a B-flat clarinet. However, giving the melody to the alto clarinet puts it in a strong part of its range, and its solid, warm voice will project above the low woodwind. If we add more instruments to strengthen the low end, such as contra-alto and contrabass clarinets, contrabassoon, and baritone and bass saxes, and then double the melody on the English horn and first bassoon, we end up with a very even spread of pitches in the lower part of the woodwind section, with a strong reedy quality. Once we finally add the upper woodwind and saxophones, we get a thick, rich woodwind texture, and the alto clarinet makes just as significant a contribution to this sound as any of the other instruments. The alto clarinet therefore has various roles in an orchestra or band: a middle voice in its own right which blends and thickens the texture, a second or alternative colour to the bass clarinet, and as a solo voice, surely an indication of its flexibility. So, what should we do with the alto clarinet? In short, write more music for it. Composers and arrangers should strive to raise the profile of the alto clarinet to that of other members of the clarinet family, to convey the message that it is very much a viable instrument, can play an extremely useful part in any ensemble, and is a convincing alternative colour for solo melodic lines. Alto clarinets of a much higher quality are now available, and good quality second-hand ones can be found too. This should make bands at all levels realise that it is definitely worth investing in a good quality alto clarinet, or at the very least, rescuing a neglected instrument by taking it to a reputable woodwind repairer who can give it a new lease of life. When a band has a player who is given the chance to dedicate time in learning the alto clarinet to a high standard, the change in the sound of the clarinet section as a whole is noticeable. At this point, we should also say that the basset horn can and should be used more in chamber music and orchestral works, so let's give it some love as well. The solo repertoire for the alto clarinet is limited, but very steadily growing. I am composing a little multi-movement work for alto clarinet and piano at the moment, and I'm enjoying writing for the instrument in a chamber capacity. I'm not aware of there being a concerto written for alto clarinet, but if you do know of such a piece, please let me know in the comments below. I would like to write a concerto for alto clarinet and orchestra one day, so if you are a professional alto player, do get in touch. Progress is certainly being made here, so we should all just keep at it. I'm hopeful that the alto clarinet's reputation will improve further. Thanks for listening everyone. Please like, comment and subscribe.